welcome to a short discussion of the art of early China from Gardner, Chapter 7. This is necessarily a huge subject with a great deal of art and a very, very long chronology, as well as a vast geographical survey, so I'm going to confine my discussion to just a few objects out of the many that are available in this chapter. We'll start with the Shang bronze, figure 7-2, the vessel known as a guang, probably a vessel associated with some sort of ritual from this period, and most of this is sort of non-historical, really, in the zone of legend, and hence we can't discuss that usage with any specificity. And so we have to sort of confine ourselves to discussing it in terms of style. And one of the things that emerges right away, besides the extraordinary technical virtuosity with which the piecemeal casting process has been used, is the inclination of the Chinese artist to adapt known natural forms, animal-like forms that litter the surface of this in just about every single square inch, as well as the overall animal form, which is of some strange species. Is it a snail? Is it some sort of horned mammal? It's hard to tell, but in any case, the vessel itself represents this taste for the abstraction, a sort of transforming natural forms into a geometry that has its own sense of life and spirit. It's very typical of these Shang bronzes. A similar sense can be seen in the B disc from the Zhou dynasty. This is in the roughly the 4th century or so BCE. Again, geometric motif dominates this sort of unity of the cosmos, perhaps symbolized by that circle, embellished with these fantastically ornate and, again, very live animated dragons. The symbolism of the dragons being as kind of messengers between heaven and earth. This is an important concept in sort of Chinese cosmology, that the order of things on earth is reflected essentially in the order of things in heaven. Gods and goddesses and so forth in China are thought of very, very differently. Indeed, aren't really present in Chinese mythology. But these mythical supernatural beings do mediate between the realms of heaven and earth, and the B disc seems to evoke that, along with, of course, its material, the material being jade, material much loved by Chinese artists for its properties of color, its refraction of light. It's a sort of semi-translucent material, a sense of warmth when you hold it. And of course, the difficulty in working with jade is it's very, very hard, brittle, and hence has to be worked with abrasion. This means that jade serves as a kind of metaphor for a kind of character that a person might have standing up to the abrasion, so to speak, of everyday life. And indeed, jade was thought to confer immortality on its wearer, and we have a very well-known suit from the Han Dynasty, which your text describes on page 195, that seems to have that purpose. The terracotta army of the Qin Dynasty gives us some sense of that really profoundly bureaucratic, legalistic, and in some ways very harsh but short reign of the Qin Dynasty, and is an extraordinary example of how far you can take a workshop in terms of creating a spectacular array of figures like that. The figure 7-7 from the Wu family shrine indicates, I think, in its own way, the importance of Confucian values. This emphasizes hierarchy within society, respect, virtue, the sense of order and stability that is so dear to the Confucian vision of society is reflected, I think, in the registers, the gestures of homage, and so forth in the Wu family shrine. It also begins to point to a new accessibility, so to speak, of art to the lower classes. In other words, memorials aren't confined strictly to the aristocracy or nobility or royalty. We see in the next period after the end of the Han, which is roughly the early decades of the 3rd century CE, the so-called period of disunity. And there are a number of interesting things that pop up in this, not least of which, of course, is Buddhist art, as shown in that Shakyamuni Buddha, figure 7-9. And the other interesting development that we'll start seeing more of as we come into the 4th, 5th, 6th centuries is a new interest in painting in China. And when you look, for instance, at that image figure 710 of Lady Feng and the bear, we can see some basic ideas of Chinese painting that are developed, of course, in Jiehei's 6 canons. I definitely recommend that you look closely at canons 1, 2, and 6 for a good foundation in regard to how Chinese artists viewed the purpose and the ultimate aim of painting. As we move forward into the Tang dynasty, Tang, we see a new sort of monumentality, even grandiosity in terms of sculpture, for instance, with the Buddhas from the Longmen Caves in figure 712, or extraordinarily complex frescoes seen in the Dunhuang frescoes. This image here of the Amitabha Buddha. This is a variety of Buddhism called Pure Land Buddhism, which essentially argues for the Buddha's divinity. Simply through believing in the Buddha, we are whisked off to this amazing paradise, which is depicted in remarkable detail in that figure 713. The Tang is a time of great prestige and power in China. It's often regarded as sort of a cultural high water mark. The image in 717, the neighing horse, is typical of Tang dynasty ceramics. And when we go to a museum, for instance, and look at Chinese Asian section, often there are many of these showing very vigorously represented animated forms with an interesting reliance, not typical, I suppose, in Chinese ceramic in general, on the spontaneous effects of poured glaze. So you can see how there are just these streams of red and green and so forth pouring down it, perhaps giving that sense of life and animation. Again, that idea of spirit consonance that we saw in Jiehei's 6 canons. That's number 1. And lastly, a few images as we come into the Song dynasty. This is from the 10th through the 13th century, a period where Chinese culture is increasingly under siege, and indeed will succumb in the 12th century to the invasion by the Mongols from the north. The Tartar forces come in and capture in 1126. When we look, for instance, at Fan Quan's Travelers Among Mountains and Streams, which is one of the great masterpieces of landscaping in world history, we're struck, I think, by the sheer size of the hanging scroll, a 6 foot by 7 foot hanging scroll that is intended in a sense to be seen at once, but ultimately can't be due to the size. As we try to, for instance, zoom in closely to the figures just to the right of that outcropping in the foreground of the painting, we're denied access, sort of visual access, to the massive stone pinnacle rising above that dominates the scene. So Fan Quan presents us with a sort of universal idea of landscape, one that encompasses the heavens, earth, the processes of nature, all of it reproduced with stunning fidelity and accuracy, but nonetheless evoking a kind of spiritual presence as well. I think this is most effectively done, for instance, with the use of voids and absences to suggest water. The behavior of water, of course, is a perennial topic of discussion with Taoist believers. And when we look, for instance, at the waterfall in the very back right of the photo of the painting, we see that it is indeed suggested by the absence of ink, of paint. The same thing goes with the marvelously suggested mists at the very base of that pinnacle. In other words, the presence of water is suggested by the absence of anything at all. The solidity that's produced by brushwork is sort of complemented, or one might say negated, by the absence of brushwork, and we read it naturally as water. And of course it moves nicely from that waterfall through the mist to the stream that runs through the foreground. So Fan Quan, in a sense, has given us this remarkably cosmic view of things, and sets an incredibly high standard, one that Western art simply won't even begin to reach until at least the beginning of the 16th century. It's a very, very remarkable painting indeed. A very different taste is seen with the Huizong, the emperor, who's been given credit for painting 719, figure 719, auspicious cranes. This is attributed to the emperor. It may be a copy. It may have been done after the emperor's direction, what have you, as it shows this flight of cranes. It was supposed to herald in 1112 a long reign. The historical record suggests otherwise, but Huizong's delicate, refined, sort of courtly style provides an interesting counterpoint to Fan Kuan's much more vigorous and realistic view of nature. And as we move into the final period for this discussion of China, we look at the Southern Song after the invasion by the Tartars in 1126. The capital is moved further south to Hangzhou, and a new style of painting emerges that's best reflected in figure 723 with Ma Yuan, a much more peaceful, tranquil, more horizontal type of image, done in this case the format of an album leaf. So somebody would flip through a series of paintings, not as in a hand scroll where you'd sort of scroll through a single continuous journey or a single image altogether as we see with a hanging scroll, but the sort of series of recollections, often in tranquility, of generally the more quiet moods of nature. And the image by Ma Yuan relies a great deal on absence. It takes that device that I mentioned already with Fan Kuan and really makes it about 2/3 or more of the painting, so that we look into this infinite vista that is suggested again by nothingness. It's a very typical, I think, device of the Southern Song, is to minimalize all that detail. When we come to our last item, looking at Liang Kai's The Sixth Chan Patriarch Chomping Bamboo, we see another direction that emerges in Chinese painting, one that will be enthusiastically adopted by Japanese artists, and that is the rough, kind of rugged and simple, direct imagery, very spontaneous, that is seen here as a Chan Buddhist, and this is going to be translated into Zen in the Japanese tradition, suddenly, while doing the most ordinary of essentially household chores, becomes enlightened as he chops bamboo. There's like this sort of crucial turning point in this humble act, and the artist, through very loose and free and spontaneous brushwork, suggests the humble surroundings, the straightforward act of chopping bamboo, but invests it with a kind of spiritual energy that I think nicely evokes its subject. And so in the very, very short time that we'd have for something like this, I would like you to recall some of these periods in Chinese art: the interest in nature, the influence of Taoism and Confucianism, the focus on brushwork and painting, and some of the different styles that we've discussed. Again, it's a very short summary, certainly nowhere near enough time is available to cover this, but I think that's a decent introduction to this subject.